Greetings. So, as some may recall, nearly 3 weeks ago, I put out a video titled, "Did you hear about the Psaq Din?" It was in reaction to the idea, or perhaps insinuation, that the recent Psaq Din by Eliezer de Mota about the Igbo had settled the question of whether Igbos are Israelites. So in that video, I had noted another Psaq Din, one from the late 90s, which declared that the last Rebbe of the ChaBaD Lubavitcher sect within Hasidic Judaism to be the Messiah. Now, the point was to usher in a more nuanced discussion about the scope and authority of Psaq Din, which is to say these sorts of rabbinic rulings. The mere existence of a Psaq Din does not automatically settle a question. You can have a Psaq Din which many Jews don't feel particularly compelled to submit to, and which likewise a great many non-Jews won't defer to either. Well, a longtime friend of this channel, who goes by the name Tazarah Ben Judah, had some comments on my video. And he shared these comments on Facebook, and I'll share a link to the relevant thread in the video description. But one of the objections which our friend shared insinuated that Chabad leadership had condemned the Psaq Din about the Rebbe. Now, as a preliminary note, let me say that even if that was true, that sort of objection would, in my opinion, make the point for me. It would mean that the mere existence of a Psaq Din does not automatically settle Jewish law, because other Jews can not only disagree with it, but even condemn it, right? Now, maybe Rabbi Demota might disagree with that, right? But whatever the case, with that objection in mind, right, I'd like to segue into what I think is an interesting question, and one that's perhaps worth exploring for the historical record, so as it were. So the question is, was the Psaq Din from the late 90s about the Lubavitcher Rebbe being the Messiah condemned by Chabad's leadership? When you follow the link which our friend Tazarah provided, it's to Wikipedia's entry on ChaBaD Messianism, right? Which itself is quoting a June 2004 piece from a periodical titled The Jewish Week. And when one looks at the actual quoted text, all it states is, quote, repeatedly condemn them in the strongest possible terms, end quote. Now, I understand that one reading the article might feel that the article itself fills in the rest of the context, but one is left to wonder why there was a need to merely quote a sentence fragment like that. You see, those familiar with Chabad-related drama or controversies know that that a statement like that could potentially be referring to a variety of things. For example, it could be referring to a condemnation of overly zealous types who perhaps engaged in vandalism or various forms of perceived aggression. Or maybe it's condemning those who are publicly pushing an accepted doctrine in public, which some consider to not yet be appropriate for pushing at this time, or not appropriate for pushing amongst people who are not particularly educated in the intricacies of Hasidic thought, right? But whatever the case, the article gives the impression that perhaps it is the belief that the Rebbe is the Messiah itself, that belief itself, which has been condemned. And our friend Tazarah believes that it perhaps entails that the relevant Psaq Din about the Rebbe being the Messiah was condemned. Well then, if those sorts of condemnations have been put forth, perhaps it's worth asking, can we see them, right? Where might these condemnations be found? And the reason why I ask is because, honestly, I have not found any explicit condemnation of the Psaq Din from Chabad leadership, right? But let's explore this, right? In this video, I want to share a few things which will start out in a very minor way, but I think they'll slowly increase and form a more clear picture towards the end. And I also want to share a couple of things that strike me as worth documenting, or which strike me as just fun. So let's begin with the most minor detail of all, but at the very least, this is something which some might find interesting. For those who don't know, New York State is currently in the middle of a race for the next governor, right? We're in the middle of an election, which will be settled about a week from now. And as is covered in some of the recent tweets by the Twitter account of Jacob Kornbluh, the current governor, Kathy Hochul, perhaps in an attempt to capture part of the coveted Hasidic voting blocks, visited the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that very rabbi who was declared to be the Messiah by the relevant Psaq Din from the 90s, right? So the current governor, Kathy Hochul, visited the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And interestingly, in an interview outside the cemetery, she seems to say that she asked the Rebbe himself for guidance. Here, consider this brief clip and fair use.
I'm very honored to be here today to visit the grave of the Grand Rebbe. It's been a journey to come here and ask for him for guidance, and also as I continue to fight for the Jewish people to keep them safe. That's really important, because safety and security, and also to honor the great traditions.
Now, like I said, that is quite minor, right? It tells us little to nothing about the prevalence of the belief that the Rebbe is the Messiah. And, first off, it needs to be noted that even Hasidic Jews who don't consider a figure to be the Messiah might nonetheless pray for a sort of intercession by that figure, right? So this doesn't establish Messianic belief. And of course, I'm not claiming that a politician's actions while on the campaign trail necessarily reflect their own actual personal beliefs. But I shared that interesting clip because it helps to set up the next clip. You see, Governor Hochul praying at the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, apparently to gain Hasidic votes, begs the question, how might her closest challenger, Lee Zeldin, top that, right? Well, there is this tweet from the Hasidic_1 account on Twitter, which humorously declares in Yiddish, Die Farmest is fertig, Zeldin hat gesagt Yechi, which means the contest is finished, it's over, Zeldin has said Yechi. And what that's referring to is a claim amongst Lubavitchers that the leading Republican candidate in the current New York State governor's race, Lee Zeldin, visited the world headquarters of ChaBaD and recited the Messianic slogan while there, the very slogan which is declared at the end of the Psaq Din from the 90s.
Yechi Adonenu Moreinu V'Rabbeinu, Melech HaMoshiach Leolam Va'ed.
So let's consider this clip, and again, fair use.
Lee Zeldin came to 770 and said Yechi Adonenu Moreinu V'Rabbeinu Melech HaMoshiach Leolam Va'ed when he put on the phone with a good friend of mine, Avram Gordon. Here in 770, the choice is clear. Go out and vote.
Now, admittedly, that too is minor and it's open to question, right? So one can question whether that particular Hasid's claim this is actually true. But what's being claimed is not implausible. And of course, if the candidate, Lee Zeldin, did recite ChaBaD's Messianic slogan, that wouldn't mean that he actually believed it. But it would seem to mean that his team, and maybe he himself, considered the Messianic wing of ChaBaD to be a powerful enough political force that it's worth paying lip service to their slogans, even while at ChaBaD headquarters itself. And with that in mind, this is the website, 770live.com. It provides a public webcam live feed inside the world headquarters of ChaBaD at 770 Eastern Parkway in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Right, and it looks right inside the main synagogue there. Now remember that we are told that ChaBaD leadership allegedly condemned the dwindling Messianic movement decades ago. So with that in mind, I find it significant that as we look at this footage, what we're going to see is that the Messianic slogan is prominently displayed on two different banners inside the main synagogue there. And again, this is at the world headquarters. You see, the footage you see here is from this morning. And of course, you can check the 770live.com site yourself, and you can peruse the synagogue's webcam live feed for yourself. But let's now take a look inside the synagogue at ChaBaD's headquarters together. And again, fair use. And, I'm just going to let the camera pan, and it pans kind of slowly, and I'm going to point out where the two banners appear, right? So forgive me if this drags on a little bit. I think it takes about 2.5 to 3 minutes to make a full circuit around the synagogue. But we're coming up on the first of the two banners, and it's the bigger of the two banners, and it's this one's going to be bilingual, the other one's going to be strictly in Hebrew. So here you go, you're beginning to see it now. You see the word ever at the bottom there, and you can even see the musical notes because they sing it. There you see there's Yechi in Hebrew, because the full phrase is Yechi Adonenu Moreinu V'Rabbeinu Melech HaMashiach L'Olam Va'ed, which means long live our master, teacher, and Rebbe, the King Messiah forever and ever. And you can see the Hebrew banner coming into view, and you can also see the tail end of the English there. And I'll just let it rotate here. Unfortunately, there's a pillar here which sort of obscures it, but nonetheless, that is the Messianic slogan in both. Then you can see there's the word Mashiach in Hebrew. This is the Messianic slogan in both Hebrew and English. Right? It's very, very large and very prominently displayed in the synagogue. And I don't know if you can see there's even a crown at the end of the Hebrew text. And now it's going to take a little bit of time to pan some more to what, if I'm not mistaken, the front of the synagogue, and you're going to see the banner again right over, what I guess would be the front, the place where most eyes would be pointed, if I'm not mistaken. But we're about to reach there in a second, so bear with me here. Okay, we're getting close now. And in a moment, the other banner is about to come into view. And again, this is at 770 Eastern Parkway in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York City. Here it is right there. So there you see Yechia Adonenu, then there's Morenu. Fortunately, a pillar blocks it a little bit, but it's blocking Verabenu. And then you see here Melech, which means king, and Hamashiach, the Messiah, Melech Hamashiach, the King Messiah, Leolam, to eternity, basically, Leolam Bayed. Now, at the very least, it's worth asking, if ChaBaD's leadership condemned Messianic belief, why are they unable to prevent the prominent displays of large banners with the Messianic slogan in the synagogue at their own headquarters, right? And with that in mind, one is within their rights to ask, can this condemnation be found in writing anywhere, right? And regarding specifically the Psaq Din from the late 90s, I decided to reach out to David Berger, a prominent critic of the belief that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is the Messiah. He's a professor at Yeshiva University. So I wrote to him to ask him if he's aware of any condemnation from ChaBaD's leadership. Here's the email I sent to him. Greetings, Professor Berger. A friend recently told me that ChaBaD leadership condemned the Psaq Din from the late 90s, which declared it obligatory to accept the Rebbe as Mashiach. However, my friend couldn't furnish the precise condemnation. And a quick note here, perhaps I'll concede that perhaps I should have wrote didn't furnish rather than couldn't furnish, but whatever the case, getting back to the email. And I myself have tried to search the internet and was unsuccessful, though that may be due to my own ignorance. You're probably the most well-informed person on this topic, and without intending any disrespect to others, I fear my local shliach might not tell me about such a condemnation, even if he knew of such, so I thought I'd reach out to you. Do you know of any explicit condemnation or rejection of the relevant Psaq Din by ChaBaD leadership? If so, might you be able to recommend a source, whether in print or digital, I might peruse? Any help in this matter would be greatly appreciated. Sincerely, AA. And here is Professor Berger's reply. He wrote to me, see pages 101 to 102 of my book. This is the closest thing I know of to a statement by a group claiming to hold a leadership position in ChaBaD, opposing the position that one is halachically obligated to believe the Rebbe is the Messiah. As I wrote, this is in fact a far less influential group than its grandiose title would suggest. The statement was not issued in response to the Psaq Din. Best regards, David Berger. So the book he was referring to was this work, titled The Rebbe, the Messiah, and the Scandal of Orthodox Indifference. It's a very interesting book, and anyone interested in the controversies over the belief that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is the Messiah might find it worth checking out. But that said, let me turn to the pages he recommended. So I'm going to turn to page 101 now, and bear with me here. This portion here is what Professor Berger was referring to in his email. He writes the following, quote, on the other hand, the Haaretz article also elicited encouraging reactions from some ChaBaD quarters. A statement denouncing deification and discouraging Messianic activism was issued and widely publicized by 14 rabbis constituting the executive committee of the Central Committee of ChaBaD Lubavitch Rabbis in the United States and Canada. Though this organization is far less important and influential than its ambitious title would indicate, the statement was meaningful and certainly merits attention, end quote. Now, I'm going to look at the text of the statement, but as it tackles two different topics, those being the deification of the Rebbe, the belief that the Rebbe is God, and the promotion of the idea of him being the Messiah, I'm going to skip over the deification part and jump straight to the Messianic topic. And that text states the following, quote, belief in the coming of Mashiach and awaiting his imminent arrival is a basic tenet of the Jewish faith. It is clear, however, that conjecture as to the possible identity of Mashiach is not part of the basic tenets of Judaism. The preoccupation with identifying the Rebbe, Zikrono Yagen Aleinu, as Mashiach is clearly contrary to the Rebbe's wishes, end quote. And moving down to the bottom of the page, here is how Professor Berger himself described the Messianic portion of that text. Quote, The paragraphs on the Rebbe as Messiah, though welcome, are considerably more ambiguous. The statement discourages the sort of preoccupation that produces public propaganda, but it does not reject the belief itself, end quote. And now let's turn to the next page where Berger continues. Quote, indeed, a story in the foreword quoted one of the signatories to the effect that his personal conviction is that the Rebbe is in fact the Messiah. The most regrettable drawback, however, is not in the statement itself, but in the gulf between the name of this group and the quite minimal influence of its geographically diverse signatories on the large majority of Lubavitcher Hasidim. End quote. And with that, I'll stop here. I want to sum up this video this way. I personally am not aware of ChaBaD leadership condemning either Messianic belief or, more specifically, the Psaq Din from the late 90s. The fact that Messianic slogans are so prominently displayed at ChaBaD headquarters, and certain politicians might think it is prudent to pay lip service to the Messianic slogan while visiting ChaBaD headquarters, leads me to doubt these claims of an official condemnation from the top being out there somewhere. However, one might object that a failure to stamp out the belief does not mean that it was never condemned. And it is worth noting, therefore, that one of the most well-informed critic of ChaBaD Messianism, Professor David Berger, is himself unaware of an explicit condemnation from ChaBaD leadership. And the closest thing he knows of is a document from lesser figures within the sect, some of whom themselves are Messianic, right? They're Messianists. Which, and the document itself merely discourages publicizing and insisting on Messianic belief. Now, mainly I wanted to share all that for the record because I find it interesting, and also I wanted to invite further discussion on this topic. So, if you have more information on ChaBaD leadership condemning either Messianic belief in general or the Psaq Din from the late 90s, please share it. But circling back to my video from nearly 3 weeks ago, which discussed both the Psaq Din from the late 90s, declaring the Rebbe to be the Messiah, and the recent Psaq Din by Rebbe Eliezer de Mota, declaring the Igbo to be Israelites, I've been accused by a proponent of the Igbo Psaq Din of trying to attack that Psaq Din by comparing it to the Psaq Din about the Rebbe. Conversely, I would not be surprised if proponents of the Psaq Din about the Rebbe in the future accuse me of attacking that Psaq Din. So with all that in mind, I just want to briefly note that I have tried to take as dispassionate an approach as possible, both in this video and in my video from nearly 3 weeks ago. I have not passed judgment on either Psaq Din. I've merely tried to spark more nuanced discussion on the scope and authority of Psaq Din in general, right, of these sort of rabbinic judgments in general. So do certain folks think that a Psaq Din automatically sets law across the rabbinic spectrum? Or do they recognize that people can disagree with a Psaq Din? And if one might wish to argue that a Psaq Din only has force among those under the authority of its signatories, might it be worth noting that the Psaq Din about the Rebbe had dozens of signatures, including that of the chief rabbi of Russia, while, to my knowledge, the Igbo Psaq Din only has one explicit signature, that of Rabbi Eliezer de Mota. So in short, the point here, and more so in my video from 3 weeks ago, is to try to invite a consistent standard for assessing Psaq Din, which is, again, these sorts of rabbinic rulings. And with that, I'll close here. As always, I invite the comments of others, comments from everyone, whether positive or negative. I don't censor comments here. And God bless.